All right, everybody, we are starting our Greek culture unit. The main focus of Notes Part 1 is going to be the Olympics, but I'm going to start off talking about something called the Oracle. So the ancient Greeks believed that there was a place you could go to and hear advice from the gods, and this place was the Oracle. And you would go to the Oracle, and the person there would give you advice, but it was in the form of like a code or a puzzle. A lot of times it didn't make sense. And then the person kind of had to interpret it themselves and see like what it was telling them. The most famous oracle was this place called the Oracle of Delphi, or sometimes it's called the Oracle of Delphi. And this is I'm just gonna say it. It's pretty messed up, but this was the situation. Archaeologists later on found that there was natural gas under this oracle building that the ancient Greeks didn't know about. And what was happening is when the oracle gave these crazy predictions in code or puzzle, they were actually drugged because they were inhaling this toxic gas. So the priests and priestesses thought they were talking to the gods and goddesses, but they were getting high off the natural gas fumes. And they were giving Greeks these predictions, and the Greeks are like, oh, the gods talking riddles, and that's why, I have to figure it out for myself. No, the oracles were high on drugs and didn't know it. So there's a little PG 6th grade action on this practice. And let me hit you up with a meme there. A lot of times the Greek city-states would go and members of the assembly would go, because you remember that it's the assembly members themselves that decide whether or not to go to war. And a lot of times they'd go to the oracle, and the oracle would give them this crazy puzzle type thing, and they'd interpret it. And a lot of times if they wanted to go to war, they would be like, oh, this proves that we should go to war. And if they didn't want to go to war, they would argue against it. So there you see that. All right, on to the Olympics. And it all starts at the gym. Yeah, ancient Greeks invented phys ed. The original goal of all athletic games in ancient Greece is to produce physical strength, stamina, and skill that you need in your daily life, but then also you need when your city-state, when your polis has to go to war. So because of this, Greek men went to work out at the local gym. And at the gym, they would wrestle, they would throw the javelin, throw the discus, run, jump, and box. Also at the gym, exercising the mind was considered important. So it would be a place that men would talk to each other, give ideas, advice, help each other train, all that kind of stuff. Women were not allowed to go to the gym. Eventually, there's some city-states where women have their own separate gyms, but men and women in ancient Greece were not allowed to work out at the same gym. Just another example of rampant sexism throughout ancient history. Now, here's how the idea for the Olympics began. Individual gyms would have competitions to see like who's the best javelin thrower, who's the best boxer, that kind of stuff. At around 776 BCE, the Greeks decided to hold an event at a place called Olympia. And this event was going to be the best people from all the gyms. And this was done every 4 years. Okay, that's why our Olympics are also every 4 years. Now there's a little kind of like but situation in there. So we have an Olympics every 2 years, but it rotates between winter and summer. So like it's 4 years between Summer Olympics and 4 years between Winter Olympics, but they don't occur in the same year. In ancient times, they don't have Winter Olympics. It's just these things that they would do in the gym, which are the events. And Olympia is a town. I'm going to zoom in. Here's our map of Greece. Olympia is right over here on Peloponnesus. So that's where the Olympics were held each year. And during the Olympic Games, all fighting would stop so that athletes that were champions of their gym could compete. So there were times during the Peloponnesian War, the Olympics stopped, and you had an Athenian and a Spartan who were like fighting each other on the battlefield, competing in a race against each other. So you can imagine how amped up, the competition was. Now, the games were held in honor of Zeus because the Greeks believed that Zeus would be pleased with the hard work and personal achievement associated with the Olympics. Now, this is why the Olympics are called the Olympics. Zeus lives where? I feel like I'm on a kids' TV show where you shout at the screen the answer. Those of you that said Mount Olympus, good job. You are correct. Because Zeus lives on Mount Olympus, a lot of times he is referred to as an Olympian god. And that's where the term Olympian comes from. And the place where they hold these Olympics, Olympia, is named after Mount Olympus. And that's the connection here. So it's in honor of Zeus. Now, the first Olympics lasted only one day, but eventually, in ancient times, it's going to grow into a full week of competitive events. Oh, before I go any further, I got another thing to show you here. Let's get this one going. So this goes with the whole no wars during the Olympics, so you can see a little bit of that. There you go. Okay. As the games grew, polises would send athletes that did the best in their gyms. There's no medals like the modern Olympics. Like your prize wasn't a gold, silver, or bronze medal. I'm going to get into a little later in the notes what the prize was in ancient times. Now, if you wanted to attend the Olympics as a spectator, they were free to go to. There were tents and booths set up around the stadium. So it was like a carnival, but there was no amusement park rides or anything like that. Now, merchants sold products there, and people were entertained by orators, and I'm going to put in parentheses what that is for you. That is a public speaker, someone that gives speeches in public. What is it? Google thinks I spelled it. Oh, because I said orators. All right, Google. I see you. I see what you did there. Philosophers. You're going to learn a lot about philosophy in Notes Part 3. Artists, acrobats. Those are people that do gymnastics. And then also magicians. Now, the conditions in Olympia were pretty gross. There's no drinking water because there's no water fountains. There's no running water. There's no bathrooms. So there's millions of flies. And this was held in August when it's really hot. So you can imagine the funk and the stink going on there. But the ancient Greeks still enjoyed the Olympics. Now, a lot of times the athletes would arrive in Olympia at least a month before the competitions. They would train and then they would be blessed by priests. So day one is their version of an opening ceremony. So there was religious observance, and each athlete swore to show good sportsmanship. And they're swearing at this statue of Zeus. Ooh, I don't have this queued up, and I totally should. The statue of Zeus at Olympia. This was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. That we could see this here. Let's get some images here. There you can see. I mean, these are all artists' renditions of this. It was destroyed by natural disaster, as a lot of ancient things were, and it might remind you of the Lincoln Memorial. If you've ever been to the Lincoln Memorial, there's here. Let's show you the Lincoln Memorial. Why say something? There's Abe sitting right here. So if you've ever been to the Lincoln Memorial, you see Abe Lincoln sitting on a big chair. Statue of Zeus. There's Zeus sitting on a big chair. The Lincoln Memorial is designed like a temple of Zeus. So this is where the athletes would swear the oath, and you better believe they are not going to cheat if they're swearing to Zeus that they're not going to cheat. Day 2, they had chariot races. In addition to chariot races, there was an 800-meter horse race, there were foot races, wrestling, and boxing, and the chariot races were held in this place called the Hippodrome, and I'm going to show you a picture in a second. It's a large oval track with seats around it. So let's check out the Hippodrome. There you see it here. Almost looks like a modern-day horse race track. So yeah, that's the Hippodrome. Now, day 3 is an event called the pentathlon. So this is 5 different events all in one day. And you might know this. Mr. Gujic, a pentagon is 5 sides. Yes, because you know penta means 5. Look at us incorporating some language arts and some math in there. That's how we roll sometimes. So 5 different events in one day. The events of the pentathlon were a 200-meter run, wrestling, long jump, discus throw, and javelin. So one athlete would do all 5 of those things in one day. So the pentathlon is basically your best overall athlete, someone that's not just good at one thing, that's good at many, many different things. All right. Day 4, tons of different events. There's a 200-meter dash. There's wrestling and boxing. Oh, and I should tell you something that's definitely going to make you be like, what? So, the ancient Olympics were done naked. The Olympians were naked as they did these things. And here's the folklore why. So one of the early Olympics, the Greeks are in togas, and this person's running their race, and their toga comes undone, and it falls off, and now they're naked, and they won the race. So the ancient Greeks thought, like, ooh, maybe, being naked gives you an advantage. So they were naked. And some of you might be like, what? When I say this next thing. So the next was wrestling and boxing in the mud and dirt. So all the dust, all the mud makes it difficult. And to win, an athlete had to pin his opponent's shoulders to the ground 3 times. In boxing, athletes would wear bronze caps for protection, but there's no gloves. You would wrap your fists in leather. And then the last event was like a no-holds-barred thing called pancratium. And I wrote here similar to UFC. If you don't know what UFC is, that stands for Ultimate Fighting Championship, which is pretty brutal. Basically, it's like a combination of like martial arts and boxing and wrestling and street fighting and whatever. Athletes in this pancratium could punch, kick, even strangle their opponents. And the match only ends until somebody surrenders or obviously gets knocked out. There was one rule of the pancratium, and that was you could not poke somebody in the eyes. Why that's the only rule, I have no idea, but that was the case. The final event of the Olympics was a 400-meter race by athletes in full battle armor. So this is where your soldiers that participate in the Olympics would be the best people for that. Now, day 5 is their version of closing ceremonies, where they would have prayers in honor of Zeus. Victors' names would be read before the altar at the Temple of Zeus, that big thing that I showed you with Zeus sitting on the throne. If you won your event, you would get a wreath of olive leaves to wear on your head. So let's show you that. As soon as you see it, some of you are going to be like, oh yeah, I've seen this. Yeah. So this was your big kind of prize. And in addition to that, depending on the city-state, some would give you like olive oil, horses. That was the thing in Sparta. Like if you were an Olympic champion in Sparta, you got a horse. And that was like, ooh. Some city-states said you don't have to pay taxes anymore. Some city-states you got free meals. And then some city-states, you didn't have to fight in wars because they were like, we want you to spend all your time training since you're such a good athlete. All right. Now, between different events at the games, there would be poets and authors that would read their works. And this guy, Herodotus, is the father of history, and he tells the story of the Persian War at the Olympics. Greeks would also date events by when it happens. Like they'd be like, oh, that happened between the second and third Olympiad, meaning like the second and third Olympics overall. All right, let's now talk about how we've get to the modern Olympics. So the ancient version of the Olympics lasts for about 1,000 years. And then what happens is this. When the Romans take over Greece, there's a Roman emperor that feels the Olympics don't really have a place anymore and bans them. And I'm going to tell you why. So by the year 394 CE, like closer to modern day, Christianity has developed, and lots of people in the Roman Empire are converting to Christianity. And because the Olympics are in honor of Zeus, the Roman emperor gets rid of the Olympics because he wants more people to convert to Christianity, and he feels like by having the Olympics, it's letting people still worship Zeus. And then it kind of spurs into something you'll learn about when we study ancient Rome, and that's the gladiatorial games. But those are very different because a lot of times they had slaves fight in these things, whereas in the Olympics, it's athletes that excelled at the gym. Now, from 394 to 1896, there were no Olympics. And then in the year 1896, there becomes a movement of, we should bring back the modern Olympics. Like, we should make a modern Olympics. And a few countries, and instead of city versus city, it's going to be country versus country. And the first modern Olympics are born in 1896, and they took place in Athens. Now, Athens last hosted the Olympics in 2004, and they did something super cool. The shot put, which is like a track and field type event, they held it in ancient Olympia on the field that the ancient Greeks used. So this is a very short little news clip about that story. So here we go. Come on, full screen. Come on, full screen. There we go. All right.
The sun rose this morning over a new day and a very old idea. Sports presented without anything but the sport itself. Fans streamed in for hours and filled the hillside. Sitting on blankets, wandering around the grounds. The world's biggest sporting event for a day seemed like it was being held in Mayberry, and for a time had the feel of a really big high school track meet. The sights and sounds, however, made it clear that this was no ordinary day. The sight of Adam Nelson, the silver medal winner, quietly sitting framed by the arch under which his predecessors had marched 2,500 years ago. The sound the shot put makes when it hits the dirt, the planet's oldest playing surface, rather than the grass to which we have all become so accustomed. What a wonderful day. Sports got smaller and simpler. Call it progress by moving backwards.
All right. I think that's pretty cool. Hopefully you do too. So now let's talk about the differences between the ancient Olympics and modern Olympics. And I'm going to add some things to my little chart here at the end of the notes. So in the ancient Olympics, it was city-state against city-state. In the modern Olympics, it's country against country. In the ancient Olympics, war stopped. In the modern Olympics, there's a hope to maybe bring peace between nations. You know, in the modern Olympics, there are some times where countries that have differences with each other, it's Olympians getting along together that prove to be a model of maybe like they can work things out. Ancient Olympics in honor of Zeus. Modern Olympics, they get lots of TV coverage, so maybe in honor of fame and money. In ancient times, winners got prizes from their city-states. In modern times, they get medals. In ancient times, they're about 5 days long. Modern times, about 2 to 3 weeks. Here's what I'm going to add in. The ancient Olympics, let's do this. Ancient Olympics always were in Olympia. That was always where the ancient Olympics. The modern Olympics, I did it again. The location changes each time. The Olympics are not always in the same place. They're in a different country, different city. And in terms of both, the best athletes compete against each other. There are opening and closing ceremonies, and athletes train for years for this. So there you go. Notes part 1, the Olympics.